Thank you, wife. Oh, I forgot every time the preacher asked me to fill in that I use paper notes, and he uses this fangled thing with an iPad, so there's not enough room on this tiny pulpit for my Bible and my notes, so I need to spread out a little bit, but that's all right. Well, good morning again. It is good to be here with y'all. And just in case you're not certain what just happened with the kids, so the plan moving forward, and this is part of the reason we did the kids ministry restart and cool down with the month of August, is so that we can let the kids participate in worship, let the kids see their parents, their families, their older siblings, and older people within the church worshiping. This is how the kids are going to learn what it means to worship. So we're going to have them check in, sit over there, so that chain of custody with the kids is they're checked in and safe. And then before the message, we'll pray for them and then kick them out to downstairs. Well, we won't kick them out. We will dismiss them to downstairs for their activities. So that's what that's all about. It's going to be a pretty cool thing. Even this morning, having them all in a group, seeing them having fun, participating in worship, yelling amen, though that might have been Emily. I'm not certain, but either way, I think it's going to bring a new kind of life into our worship, and it's going to be pretty cool. So today is the first Sunday of September, and that means today is the first Sunday of, don't say September, Missions Emphasis Month. So, all throughout the month of September, we are going to hear from all of our different missions team advocates. I almost said activists. No, advocates. We're going to hear from our advocates and learn about the different ministries and missions opportunities that our church is involved in, and how we can actively participate and get involved personally with missions from our church. Then, on September the 28th, we're going to take out some time of both of our regular worship services, and we're going to actively participate in two of our missions opportunities. In the first service, we're going to build buckets for God's Bucket Brigade, and if you don't know what that is, stay tuned because spoilers. And then in our second service, we're going to put together shoe boxes for Operation Christmas Child, and we're going to do these activities as a church. So, if you want to get up early that day, come to the first service too and build some buckets, and then come to the second service and build some shoe boxes. Deal? Nice. There we go. See, I expect no participation from the first service because most of them are pretty old. But usually a little bit of back and forth makes it easier to communicate. But this morning, I want to share a little bit of the vision that I have for our church and our missions team going forward in regard to our missions efforts. So bear in mind, this will be the super abbreviated bullet point list of what I presented to our missions team a couple of months ago. I called it a theology of missions. But yeah, anyway, so if you have any questions or you want to hear more about where I see our missions efforts going, just let me know, shoot me an email, text, or verbally, and we can talk about it. And if you would like, I could probably put together a PowerPoint, and we could discuss it that way. So, when I first started thinking about our church and missions. I started thinking about missions as a whole and what it means to do missions, to participate in missions. And I was pointed to the idea of what is God's mission. And overall, throughout all of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, it is clear that God's is a mission of reconciliation. His whole purpose from the fall was to bridge the gap and reconcile the relationship between God and man. Right? So, the culmination of all of God's mission, of all of missions, the culmination of it is worship. It starts when someone is first drawn to God, then continues when the gospel is accepted. That's when the reconciliation really happens, when you accept the gospel. And after reconciliation comes worship. If you take a look, and we're not going to read through it because this is not the sermon. This is the sermon before the sermon. In Romans 11:33 through chapter 12, verse 2, we see that that life is worship. And then in Philippians chapter 1, verses 20 through 26, we see that life is missions. So life is worship and life is missions. That means that participating in missions is inherently an act of worship before God. And this is what I mean. Missions glorify God because of the spread of the gospel, and missions glorify God because of the obedience of his people. And this is the kind of attitude and motivation that I want us to go into this missions emphasis month with. One that reminds us that missions glorify God because it is a part of our reasonable act of worship that we see in Romans 12. The point is, so all that to say, missions emphasis month is going to be cool. All right, now we'll jump into Habakkuk. So, over the last 3 weeks, I believe, if I did my math right, we have seen the prophet present his own perspective to God, right? And while he voiced his complaints, and then we saw God's perspective in which God addressed the prophet's complaints, and then we saw that even in the prophet's understanding of who God is and what God has done, the prophet still attempted to help God understand the answer he was looking for was not the answer that God had given him. As a summary, in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, the prophet said, God, why aren't you listening? Then in verses 5 to 11, God said, I'm listening, be patient. Now this is all summarized and paraphrased, just so as you know. Then the remainder of chapter 1, the prophet said, no, Lord, you should understand, but really you don't. Verse 12, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. My Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. Do you see the snark that the prophet approached God with? And this kind of reminds me of Job, which is one of my favorite Old Testament books, because Job's like, I ain't did nothing wrong. I didn't do nothing to deserve any of this. And God responded. Where were you when I set the world on its foundations? Of course, you know where I store the snow. Ooh, that's when God gets a little bit snarky. I don't know if you're allowed to say that from the pulpit, but I did. But do you see the parallel? Like, God, you really don't understand. And then, I tell you, God, he super does understand. So that seems like a fair summary and assessment of Habakkuk so far, yeah? Are we in agreement? Cool, a thumbs up. So, today we're going to be starting Habakkuk chapter 2. And this is where the prophet kind of hits a bit of a turning point. This is where we see the prophet resign himself to trusting God rather than relying solely on his own ideas. The ideas that he would have come up with from his own human and limited perspective. But instead, he'll switch to understanding that God knows what he is doing and deserves our trust and our faithful service. So turn to Habakkuk chapter 2, and we're going to read verse 1. If it helps, it's on page 835 in mine. I will stand my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Immediately, we see the prophet's determination in this statement. I will stand. I will watch. I will look, and I will see what he says to me. And for see what he says to me, we're going to go with, I will listen. All four of these very crucial decisions the prophet really had to make, or willingly had to make, in order to be obedient to the Lord. And something interesting I'd like to point out is that in order to be able to watch, the prophet must first stand. In order to look for what God is doing and what God would do, he first needed to watch. And in order to listen for what God would have him do, he needed to look. Each piece of the prophet's decisions needed to build upon the last one in order for the prophet to willingly and truly await and obey the Lord. You can't watch unless you stand. You can't look unless you watch. You can't listen unless you look. So when it comes to defining the prophet's decisions, he needed, first and foremost, to decide to stand. And it's no different for us today. In order to get to a point where we are truly able to jump into what God is doing within our families, within our church, within our community, our city, we need to, on purpose, decide to stand. With all that said, and before we can come about making the decision to stand, we probably need to answer the first question. What does it mean to stand? And I'm not talking about the physical reality that when you put your feet on the ground and extend your legs in defiance of gravity, suddenly you're standing upright. No, this is a metaphorical act of standing. The idea of standing is an interesting concept. When I was preparing for this message, I thought about what it meant to stand for several days. And I came to the conclusion that it's weird because standing can be used in an accurate way with opposing ideals. Does that make sense? So you can stand and affirm something or deny it. You can stand to obey or stand to disobey. You can stand to attack or stand to defend. You can stand to support or to defy. It struck me as odd that to stand could mean completely opposite things depending on your perspective. Ultimately, I came to the conclusion that to stand is to draw a line in the sand and say, all right, it's time to put your foot down. For the prophet in particular, it meant submitting himself in obedience to the will of God, regardless of what the people would say. His decision to stand set in motion his change in perspective from his own understanding into reliance on God's understanding. The prophet's journey led him to a place where he would listen, and he would look, and he would watch, and he would stand. And getting to that place requires no small measure of faith, of passion, of drive, and determination. So we're going to put a pause on Habakkuk for a minute, and we're going to take a look at a young man with just such a combination of traits. This guy was a king, a warrior, a poet, and a shepherd. But most importantly, he was a man after God's own heart. And that was David. Yeah. So turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I will set the scene. So, at this point in the history of Israel, this is following Joshua's conquest of the promised land. This is following the time of the Judges. And I believe it's in Judges chapter 2. So this is a little bit of background before Israel was like, dude, we need a king. So in I think it's Judges chapter 2, the author wrote, an entire generation grew up and returned to their fathers. So an entire generation grew, lived, and died without having learned about the Lord. So an entire generation of Israel grew up not knowing about who God was or what God had done for them, specifically in the conquest and the Exodus and the first covenant with Abraham, right? So an entire generation of God's people didn't know God. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Which, if you know most people, or many people, doing what's right in your own eyes, probably not always a good thing. So the people cried out for a king, and God said, fine. Saul became king. Eventually, Saul did some real dumb stuff. This is paraphrased, by the way. You won't find the phrase real dumb stuff in the book of 1 Samuel. So Saul did a bunch of bad stuff, and ultimately God rejected him. Then the prophet Samuel left Saul and went to the town of Bethlehem, where he found a guy named Jesse, and then finally anointed David, Jesse's youngest son. And our story begins in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 1. That's the wrong page. There we go. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled in Socoh and in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-Dammim between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That's about 9 feet. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. That's about 125 pounds, which is like real heavy. So on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul?" Interesting point. As far as Saul had led the people of Israel away from God, their enemies didn't even call them servants of the Most High. He called them servants of Saul. That's just something interesting. Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So our scene is set. The Israelites were scared and cowering in their camp before this hulking behemoth of an enemy. And now, for the sake of time, we're going to skip ahead to when David comes to the camp. So in verse 25, now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." Incentive. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion and a bear came and carried off sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hands of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. I know that was a lot of reading compared to normal, but we need to get the full story. And the bottom line of this story is that Goliath mocked God, and David took that personally. When all of the rest of the Israelites were cowering in fear, and even his oldest brother tried to get him to back down from talking about what was going on, it's important to notice some practical stuff surrounding this story. In media, especially media for kids like VeggieTales. Y'all remember VeggieTales? Yes? So in media and cartoons and even like storybook Bibles, what does David look like? He's always portrayed as like an 8 to 13-year-old boy with soft cheeks, and he's sitting on a nice patch of grass on a hill with some frolicking sheep, and he has a harp. Right? But that's not quite what David was like. It's true that he was a shepherd, and it's true that he was a musician and a poet, but David was not a frail child. Yes, he was young. No, he wasn't a hulking behemoth, but he was a shepherd. And in fact, we know he wasn't a frail child because while he was discussing how God could defeat Goliath, that Goliath had nothing on his God, we see that David, in protecting his sheep, had not only protected them both from bears and lions, he killed at least one of them with his bare hands. He said he grabbed it by the hair and struck it dead. I don't know if you know much about bears, but one ought not try to punch a bear to death. All right? Most pistol calibers can't pierce a bear's head, just so we all know that. Like, these things you ought not grab by the scruff of the neck and punch. David was not a frail child, young but a shepherd. Another thing is we belittle the sling a lot. We think of a little boy with a slingshot that's not much more useful than maybe hunting rabbits or squirrels. But have any of you ever studied some ancient war tactics? Slingers were a very important part of ancient armies, right? So this was essentially old school snipers, right? They would use, depending on the time period, either stones, I believe the Romans used lead bullets, and they would swing this length of cord or leather about this long, and there was two of them, and you'd grab both of them, there's a little pouch, you'd put your projectile, you'd swing it a few times, and then let go of one of the straps, and those things would and hit and destroy, essentially. A skilled slinger, depending on the projectile, could launch a projectile up to 200 miles per hour. This was not a toy that David went up against Goliath with. David had in his hand a weapon of war. But that's not the point. It's just interesting. But this is another reason why it's important to read the whole story. Because a lot of us, I know for me, I remember all of the VeggieTales. I remember all of the storybooks. But we need to get to the point where we get the full picture. Because those are appropriate for their intended audience. Just like Paul said, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thunk like a child. Now that I'm a man, I must think like a man. Anyway, that's not the point either. So David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David had approximately 0 doubt in the power of his God. God had protected him this far, and David had no reason to believe that God wouldn't continue to protect him before this new enemy. He trusted that God would deliver him from Goliath. This is the faith of David. He had experienced God's protection, and he believed that his God would not leave him. We also see David's passion. He saw Goliath taunting his people, mocking his God, and for David, there was no other option. Goliath had to go. We see his drive while he was dressed in armor that he was unfamiliar with. He refused to take it, not to make any bigger spiritual point, because he didn't practice with it and he felt clunky. We see his determination when Goliath taunted him and started coming toward him. What did David do? He sprinted at the giant. Not once did David complain. Not once did David wonder whether or not his God would protect him. David's decision to stand before the face of certain, imminent, and horrible death, he stood against the enemies of God. To stand in obedience to the covenant between God and Abraham. I will be your God, you will be my people. This is what it means to stand. David had every single earthly right to keep his head down and do nothing except what he was told to do. In the chunk of the passage that we skipped, David was asked by his father to take some supplies to his brothers at the war camp and get some news from what was happening there and then come back. David could have, and he had every right to just do what he was told, but he saw an enemy mocking God and taunting his people, and he said, "No, it's time." And he stood. When he was faced with the decision to mind his own business or to stand, he stood in obedience and he did something on purpose. So let's go back to Habakkuk 2:1 and read that again. "I will stand my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give this complaint." Back in the days where cities and towns would have walls, the most important job was the job of the watchman. This would be a guard who would stand on the wall, the rampart. There's a visual aid. He would stand there and keep watch for threats. If the watchman didn't stand, he couldn't see what was happening. If the watchman didn't stand, people died. If the watchman stood but didn't keep watch, people died. If the watchman stood and kept his watch, but didn't look, people died. If the watchman stood, kept his watch, and looked around but didn't listen or pay attention, people died. The watchman had to be steadfast in his charge. That's why the prophet said, I will stand my watch. I will station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what the Lord would have me do. This is a paraphrase. Oh, it's not there. Yeah, this is a paraphrase. So, this is the same thing as now. And this is the reason that the pastor has decided to do this particular passage during Missions Emphasis Month. For us, as believers now, on this side of the cross, we have been charged to be watchmen of a different sort. When we look at the final marching orders of Christ in Matthew 28 and Acts, I almost said Romans, in Acts 1, we are to make disciples. We are to be his witnesses. These are not passive roles. These are active roles that require us to make the decision to stand and go and make disciples. Because guess what? If we don't stand, and we don't watch, and we don't look, and we don't listen, people die. I want to say there's like 200,000 people like in and right around Independence. Does that sound right? We'll go with 200,000. How many of them, of people we know, coworkers, family members, old friends, are walking in blissful ignorance toward a forever grave? Because the supposed watchmen in their lives did not stand. I understand that we won't need to fight a giant, probably. But the opportunity to stand, the responsibility to stand is no less crucial for the believer today. And just like David, we need to have faith and passion and drive and determination. We need to make the decision to take our faith seriously enough to act as though we believe what we claim to believe. It's time to draw the line and say, I will stand, I will obey what Jesus had commanded when he said, go and make disciples. One of my favorite things to say for the last couple years is you ask a teenager, hey, what's the meaning of life? Because people have been asking that forever and ain't nobody has come up with a good answer. I did. 1, know God. And 2, make God known. That's the meaning of life. And it's just 2 things, which is super simple. So that's our challenge today and in the coming weeks is make the decision to stand. Why don't you stand? We're going to go before the Lord in prayer, and we're going to continue on in worship. Father, thank you for this time.